Susan, you were speaking there. You might, I don't know if you want to come in, Susan, there. Where you spoke, I suppose, Susan, you summing up our whole discussion. Our discussion was about how we could look at, and I know the second question is how it might change your research, and maybe this filters into this would filter into the research, but taking into consideration the colonialism of one's own mind, place, and positionality. So
thanks, Caroline. I don't have anything else to add. I think you got it perfect.
Okay, and I thank you, and I think that that filtered into the second part. And what was the third question? What was the third question?
What future collaborations might arise for your research as a result of today?
Yeah, well, I've been trying to keep up with the notes. So yeah, there's lots of ideas and concepts and books and thoughts and views being shared. So I can envisage many collaborations. If anybody else wants to, Niamh, did you want to say anything?
Before Niamh comes, just a quick one. So Niamh was talking about colonizing the agency, and then we were talking about, then you linked it to conversations such as Shift the Power movement, which is what you were talking about in somewhere. And then the whole point about local, not global, linking to aspects, women's circles, for example, or communities getting engaged. And one of my closest topics was seed sovereignty, soil, not oil, kind of, that's what Roisin was focusing on.
Yeah, and Roisin brought in the permaculture as well, Roisin. Thank you.
I just add the last thing that wasn't discussed at all, but there's the future opportunities, I think, because I heard quickly, briefly, I don't remember the name, Lorraine, talking about IDRC, International Development Research Center, Genevieve, sorry, and the support they give to local researchers in Africa, and I think that could be actually a good organization to exchange with, instead, like maybe having some kind of assessment of what kind of research is ongoing, to see if there is some similarity to put together students like me with some students from the South, and see if there are common interests that can be developed further in the future. I think that could be nice.
Can I just add into that? I won't be able to join you tomorrow because I have a fractured wrist and I can't drive, unfortunately. So yeah, it's not easy to get from, you wouldn't imagine so, but it's not easy to get from Gorey to Thurles because public transport doesn't go straight lines. You have to go around the country to get there, unfortunately. So I can't join you tomorrow, but I'd love to. I won't get the opportunity to speak to Sharanya when you were speaking this morning. I'd love to have a conversation with you, particularly around colonising agency. But if there's another way I can connect with Sharanya and everyone, that would be great.
Yes, I'll get in touch with you, Niamh.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Nita.
Yeah. Thank you. Have we another group who'd like to report back? I think we had 3 altogether. Paul, do you want?
I might report back quickly. I'm just saying, Niamh, I was thinking, could I think of a way to get you from Gorey to Thurles? But I think we might have left it a little bit late. But no, I might.
Have you a helicopter?
Yeah, that's unfortunately is the way. Everything seems to only go in straight lines here, through Dublin. But say from our group's perspective, I suppose I'd like to confess, first of all, my active resistance against colonialism was that I didn't follow the instructions at all. So my unintended consequences are that I'll report back from the group, but we followed a sort of a slightly different trajectory in terms of our discussions, which were really, I think, really interesting as well. And I think the basis that we were talking, or how our conversation, I suppose, evolved really was to struggle and to reflect on the term Indigenous and what we mean by Indigenous, and I suppose the consequences in terms of or the implications of looking at development and Indigenous. And one of the things that emerged was how I suppose a reflection on the experience of Indigenous communities can be quite common across different the lived experience, whether it's in Africa or Asia or in North America or in America, is quite common, and it shares a lot of characteristics that people who experience poverty generally, whether they describe themselves as Indigenous or not, experience in a development context, and that set us sort of on a conversation about how we define Indigenous and how we understand Indigenous, and that it is really important in terms of looking at Indigenous development and research. And Katie gave us a very good overview of his experience of working with Indigenous communities in Botswana. Katie, is it Botswana?
Yeah, that's Botswana. Yeah.
I'm not going to repeat. I think maybe could you share maybe what you spoke about in terms of how your experience of Indigenous communities in Botswana?
Yeah, actually, when we spoke about trying to understand the concept of Indigenous knowledge, I said it's something that is very difficult because of the different people or different communities have a way of actually defining their own culture or the way they actually understand Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous concepts. Even different researchers from the various literature that I've actually read, different people come up with different ways of actually trying to describe what Indigenous knowledge is. And as we speak, this is one of the concepts that are actually very much debatable. And because of the fact that different communities, they have a different way of actually describing or explaining themselves based on their cultural ways of living or cultural ways of doing things. Yeah.
And I think one of the things that really struck me about how you spoke is that as an outsider research coming in, trust is enormously important, because in the transfer of knowledge, you're asking them to trust you with something which is fundamentally important, not only to their worldview, but to their past and future existence.
Yeah, exactly. Because Indigenous communities are very sacred by nature. They try to protect their knowledge. They try to protect their cultural practices. So they're not willing to share any of this with anyone that they don't actually trust. So it's very, very important that as researchers to establish very strong relationships with them, so that they can be able to open up. In my case, I divided my field research into two phases, the first phase and the second phase. And importantly for me, for the first phase was to actually try to establish those connections, those relationships, so that they can actually understand me and even myself to actually be in a position to understand these Indigenous communities, the cultural protocols that are to be actually followed to actually conduct research within these communities. So trust is very, very essential. They're not going to be able to open up to anyone until they are sure that you are genuine, you are authentic, you will handle that information in the manner that really deserves to be handled.
And I think that came across really strongly in the discussion. And another thing that emerged in our discussion is that conflict of values, perhaps that conflict of culture that happens when there are elements of an indigenous way of life or a Western way of life where there is a conflict in values. And again, we didn't get to the bottom of that discussion, but again, it opened a really interesting avenue maybe for future discussion, is what happens when when there's a problem in relation to malalignment of values, and perhaps around gender, perhaps around other issues. So yeah, I think we stopped. That's when when Brian pulled us out and threw us into the other room. So it was an unresolved discussion, but I think one that might benefit from some further exploration.
Okay, thanks, Paul. I think there's a third group. Is that right? Or have we heard from everybody? Okay, maybe we've heard from everybody. Unless anybody else wants to say anything to finalize? No? Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so I'm just going to sum up. I wouldn't say in any way to give an overview of the day is what I'm trying to do, rather than trying to summarize in any way what people have had to say, because so much has been said, and I'm sure we all want to thank the presenters that we've had today, and I'll name them in a minute. Just in terms of some of the highlight issues, I suppose first of all, what we've seen today from various locations of various places is that Indigenous people's rights have been breached and continue to be breached, and their assets to be appropriated via modernising extractive systems and structures. I think that we can't be in doubt about that after what we saw today. However, this extractive development model can be resisted by Indigenous people and those who support them. And I suppose that we would like to be seen as people who support Indigenous people in their struggle against this extractive model of development. And we saw some very good examples from different parts of the world about how Indigenous systems can overcome colonialism and oppression if supported properly. But I suppose the first step, and this might be the biggest challenge of all in some ways, is what was put to us today in terms of decolonization of the self, or challenging our own privileges as the first step in the development process if we want to work with Indigenous people and indeed with women. And learning from and working for Indigenous people in a respectful, curious and equal relationship is essential. But first we have to decolonize ourselves and our own mindset. And then we need to look at our own academies, that the academy needs to radically change by recognising Indigenous knowledge systems over colonial themes and colonial theories. So decolonising the academy and the places where we work, and asking ourselves, who are we doing this work for? And this brings us on to the heart of the issue around development. So we need to redefine development via an Indigenous lens and dismantle academic coloniality. And then in the broader sphere, we can see how women are similarly marginalised. The idea of the displaced woman that we heard about today, oppressed via the male gaze, needs to be challenged. And again, we as development practitioners or as researchers need to take that on board. Are we looking and regarding women through a colonial type lens? And maybe arts-based research could be a tool here in assisting in this process. And then finally, I think what I picked up is that intersectionality as an approach in terms of our research, looking at gender, race, class, and Indigenous status together, rather than as separate themes, if you like, to be researched. And I think just to leave you with what many of the researchers talked about today, about decolonizing the mind first as being an essential component if we want to work in this territory. So I think we'd all like to thank Maui, Petronelle, Sharanya, Martina, Benno, Carol and Anu, Gerard and Prajal for their presentations today. So I don't know if anybody has any final questions or comments.
Just to thank Paul and Brian and Paula for pulling in this, putting it all together. Thanks.
Thank you, Nita. You've done a Trojan work, in terms of keeping things on track. But that's great. And and thank you, Catherine, very, very much for facilitating that. Just before we finish, and we will finish before the clock ends at 14:30 or 4:30, that tomorrow, anybody that's coming, we're really looking forward to it. It's going to be a very applied day. It's going to be very practical. We're going to visit place and connect with some of the sacred places here in Tip. We're going to look at theatre of the oppressed as a methodology. We're going to look at poetry as a form of research, and we're going to look at collective construction of art and creative content as a way of researching and mobilizing community. So it's going to be a really exciting day. It's quite different, and we're going to be in buses, and we're going to have a lot of fun. I hope. The one thing that I would sort of draw to your attention is that Uma, who is going to be doing a session on film as a process of generating and reflecting on community, she gave me a copy of her film, and it's on YouTube. So I put it in the chat. So if anybody's going to attend that workshop tomorrow, it would be really good. Or even if you aren't, it's a really interesting piece of work around rocks and their importance in an Indigenous community in India. And as it will happen, we'll be visiting the Rock of Cashel, which again is a very sacred sort of physical space here in Tipperary. So it would be good if you were able to take a look at that before the workshop. But other than that, all it remains to say is relax, take it easy. We'll see you all. Travel safely if you're traveling down to Thurles tomorrow, and we'll see you down in the Premier County. And we will coup here in Tipperary. We're very proud of Thurles and the county, but we're really looking forward to having you here. And to those that won't make it and can't make it, hopefully you'll have an opportunity again in the future to come down, but do keep in touch. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, Paul, Nita.
Thank you.
Catherine.
Thank you.
Thanks,
The rest
Thank
of the
you.
Trust
Bye.
team. Thank you. Thanks, Miriam.
Thank you. Sticking around. Bye.
DSAI.